Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's ThinkIn. Should the UK leave the Commonwealth? That's the official title of this ThinkIn. I guess the unofficial question here is, what kind of country is Britain? What kind of country is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland? Perhaps there's a bit of a clue in the name that we are still an imperial country. And I think there is a story here about Britain's past and how it affects our present, and a story that's written into news stories. So whenever we read a story about the Cayman Islands, when we read a story about the British Virgin Islands, when we read about Edward Colston, who was an imperial figure, when we think about the people who arrived on the Windrush, there are all sorts of stories that weave together Britain's past and Britain's present and connect us to other people around the world. So we're going to discuss that, and we're going to think about what that means for us today and what kind of country we are. I'm really pleased to be joined to discuss this by Sue Onslow, who is a specialist in oral history. She's director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, and she's published extensively on Southern Africa in the Cold War, and also by the Right Honourable David Howell, who was a Minister of State at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And it's not often that we pause to think of the word Commonwealth in that title of the FCO. We were going to be joined by Kojo Korum, who's the author of this book, Uncommon Wealth, which I'm really enjoying reading at the moment. Very unfortunately, due to a family predicament, Kojo can't join us tonight. We hope that he can join us another night for another discussion, but we'll have to press on without him regardless. Sue and David, in that order, if I may, I'd like to begin with just a sort of quick question to you both, and that is, does anyone care about the Commonwealth? Sue first, if I may.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to join this forum. Does anyone care about the Commonwealth? I care about the Commonwealth, but excuse me, in the broader context, yes, people do care about the Commonwealth. There is a genuine puzzlement and misunderstanding about the modern Commonwealth in the United Kingdom that's directly connected with lack of education about what the Commonwealth evolved from and what it actually achieved, particularly from 1949. Elsewhere across the globe, there is still a residual appreciation of the Commonwealth, a feeling of its relevance, of its ties, of its value, and the fact that two African countries have just joined the Commonwealth, making it now an association of 56 states, and there is a waiting list to join. But certainly the Commonwealth has got a communications problem. It does have a perceived relevance problem, but yes, there is still a considerable constituency across the globe that do care about the Commonwealth. Thank you, Sue.
And David, who's joining us from the House of Lords, the same question to you. Does anyone care?
I think Sue is a very fair summary, but there is, if I may, before even answering your question, say this: a mindset leap is needed in discussing this whole issue and the question you put, because the point is that the Commonwealth network today is not just governments. So far, everything you said in your introduction has been as though nations and governments have officially signed up and so on to it. But the basic understanding is that we live in the digital age, in which connectivity is at work and networks at work at every level in society. Some people say what I'm talking about is populism taking over. And in a sense, I'm saying that there are 14 billion mobile handsets in the world. I'm saying that entire nations, almost all of the Commonwealth, are now connected up through their professions and interests, and to some extent through business, but that's not the main connector, and through common causes in a way that's really has never been allowed before in history. We're in a completely different pattern from either 1949, which your summary didn't mention, which was the original declaration of 8 countries, I think, and the one where Nehru said, look, republics can join the Commonwealth, and that moved the whole thing on from the old British Commonwealth concept. And we're completely different from that, because why? We have 54, I think it's now 56 members, and still people queuing to join. And obviously there is a a momentum here, which I think official analysis, and talking as you seem to be talking about governments joining, can't get hold of, and officials can't get hold of. So I'm talking about the reality of today. I love the history, and I admire greatly those who are trying to explain this evolution and where it comes from. And I understand there are all sorts of relics and bones and skeletons that come into it. But what we're talking about is something completely different from the past now, and much more attuned to the digital connectivity age into which we're moving at great speed.
All right. Well, I'm very interested in what the Commonwealth means for people and what the Commonwealth means at a personal level. And I'm really interested in hearing from everyone who's here actually in the chat tonight about what it means for them personally. And I'll maybe say at this point a little of what it means for me personally, because my mum and dad actually both came from Commonwealth countries. And I remember my dad talking to me about this. Well, they came from imperial countries as they were at the time. And I remember my dad talking to me about his feeling about coming to England and understanding that he was coming to what he was led to believe was the mother country, which was maybe was astonishing to me and would maybe be astonishing to lots of people today. And he was very quickly, when he arrived, disabused of this notion that it was the mother country for him and sort of, categorized kind of very clearly as a foreigner. But it was a sort of genuine feeling that I think people had in the British Empire, that they were all part of a single collective. Sue, if we could begin with talking about the past, I'd just like to think about the kind of more recent past, so more recently to the empire, and talk about apartheid. So that it seems to me, and you will be our guide on this, gave something of a defining kind of mission to the Commonwealth, or to some countries in the Commonwealth. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I would say that it is. Certainly the Commonwealth at their heads of government level, at the political level, did play a very important part in the global anti-apartheid struggle. But picking up on what David had said about the Commonwealth operating in the recent past at multiple levels, the global anti-apartheid struggle, of course, was not just governments, it was also civil society activists, it was individuals. Yeah. And it's precisely because the Commonwealth operates in this multi-tiered, multi-layered way. It is not simply the idea of this donut shape of connectivity and just states acting in this. The other way that the Commonwealth was, as an organization, was particularly relevant in the recent past was its role in development, because the majority of countries in the Commonwealth after 1949, particularly after the early 1960s, were, of course, newly independent developing states, and particularly from the 1970s onwards and 1980s, that they were small states, small island developing states. So the Commonwealth played a very important part in global pressures, with an S, to end racial oppression inside South Africa, inside Southwest Africa and Namibia, and of course had earlier done it for Zimbabwe, but had played a very important part in terms of helping newly independent states with their development agendas.
So I think one of the themes really for this discussion is race and the Commonwealth, and apartheid sort of touches on that really, really clearly. As I understand it, Sue, I mean, there were differences within the Commonwealth about how to approach apartheid South Africa. And I mean, this is sort of my understanding as someone, as a layman, really. So please correct me if I'm wrong, but there were differences between the way that Britain under the Conservatives thought South Africa should be dealt with and other Commonwealth countries. I mean, is that right, or is that an oversimplification?
I'm going to say very briefly, because David, as a former government minister, can talk cogently about this. But yes, there were differences, but there was a unity of opposition and of loathing of the system of apartheid, and a determination that it had to come to an end. There were differences of approach, differences of diplomacy. Britain was regularly hauled into the dock by the Commonwealth, and complaints made that that Mrs. Thatcher's government particularly was not more enthusiastic about bringing in economic sanctions for very cogent reasons in British political judgments. But there was no sense whatsoever that the Conservative government in any way, shape or form was a friend of apartheid. There was a determination to assist in the transition and the unraveling of that appalling system of racial oppression.
David, could you give us some insight on this? was there a difference of views? Yeah. Was there a shared mission really on this?
Well, I mean, I think it's Sue puts it extremely well. Apartheid, of course, was all about race. I'm trying to think of how many years ago the great battles were fought on apartheid. But again, with my central contention, which is betrayed by your words, actually, that we are living in a completely different situation. We draw obviously lessons from the past. We're fools not to do so. But when you talk about your dad coming to Britain as though this is some sort of hub or center now, maybe it was. Maybe that's the way it was looked at, but not now. We're not talking about hubs and spokes and centers and home countries. We're simply not using that language anymore. We're talking about a network. And in a network, of course, there are thicker and thinner connections, but everything is connected to everything else. Now, when you talk to officials in the Foreign Office here, the Foreign Office, Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, they find it very difficult to understand that. They say, well, we haven't got time to talk to 54 or 56 countries a day. We haven't even got time to talk to some of our close countries. And the small islands, well, they're strategically not very important. And the bigger members of the Commonwealth, many of them are richer than us, and they have their own agendas. There's that sort of view around. But again, that's a pre-digital age of view. It is possible now, thanks to what we're doing now, the way we're communicating now, for officials throughout the network to connect with each other every single day. Indeed, every single hour. You might even say every single minute. So that connectivity is the key to understanding why more and more people are beginning to realize that the world of blocks and alliances and formal treaties and vast secretariats piled on top of everything, and even spheres of influence, which of course the Americans are still fond of, and so the Chinese, don't fit in with the attitude of many of these countries who want to be independent, assert their independence, not be in anybody's sphere specifically, but allow their peoples to network. And of course, with the common English language for certainly commercial purposes, if not for all ordinary purposes throughout the Commonwealth system, and with the glue and links of the past that Sue's rightly talked about, and with other features which still do link us through our history, through the bridge of history back to what went before. All this is beginning to hum and work. It's like a blood transfusion that's been put into the system. I don't think a lot of people get that, and I'm not even sure. I don't want to be, let's be extremely friendly on this, but have you really got it? Because you'll keep talking about governments and coming tos, and you put in your opening comment some rather, I think, obtuse and very negative comment from Philip Murphy, who, in my view, doesn't understand what has happened. He didn't put anything about all the tremendous statements that are flying around from the younger generation about the network. None of that went into your introduction. I'm beginning to wonder whether you quite understand what we're talking about.
Yeah, I guess the purpose of these events is to deepen all of our understanding, including mine. So hopefully I'll emerge from it better informed. And I'd like to come back to the point that you're raising, David, and maybe sort of think about what the mission of the Commonwealth is and what it might have achieved and what it has in common, which are the things you're sort of touching on. But I actually just want to stay on one kind of race-related question now, and maybe come back to you on this, Sue, which is, Black Lives Matter has obviously been a really significant event for a lot of people in the world. Has it had an impact on the Commonwealth nations? And if so, what has it had?
It's certainly the Black Lives Matter movement has certainly had a significant impact in the Caribbean, in the push towards republicanism and a desire that Caribbean states should no longer have the Queen as head of state, and the drive for reparations from the British government to address the long-lasting legacies of slavery, but that this has been a part of a complex drivers push towards republicanism and for independence from the former colonial tie, the vestiges of former colonial ties with the United Kingdom. But I really want to stress that this has got nothing to do with the modern Commonwealth as that diverse interconnectivity, that the spider's web of networks, some of which are stronger than others and operate at multiple levels. And I think that it's fair to say that they are stronger in the older generation rather than in necessarily the the networks of youth, although they are there. However, it must be underlined the majority of countries inside the modern Commonwealth are republics. And in fact, back in 1949, one of the reasons for the construction of the modern Commonwealth was to include India as a republic, a free association of states under the symbolic headship of the British monarch. So we have this apparent anomaly that the ceremonial head of the Commonwealth is the British monarch. It is currently the Queen. It will then become Prince Charles as in a ceremonial leadership role. And the Queen and increasingly Prince Charles, it's very clear, are passionate advocates for Commonwealth causes and for climate change, for collaboration at multiple levels to address the significant challenges in the international community and within countries. But this has got nothing to do with whether 15 countries across the globe have still got the Queen as head of state.
So I think there are two things that you're raising in your reply, Sue, that are really interesting. One of them is what happens after the Queen. So is there a sort of different head of the Commonwealth, or a different sort of person who's at the center of it? And the second of them is sort of what is the glue? What is the sort of bond? So we've mentioned, I think, the English language in an earlier answer, which I suppose applies to countries apart from Rwanda and Mozambique. But what are the other kind of binding elements? And I'm noticing in the chat, Julia Lambert saying, from my time living in the Caribbean, the British Virgin Islands, the culture was completely oriented towards the US. And I spoke to a Canadian friend about the Commonwealth, and he said Canada, in his view, was oriented towards the US as well. So is there, are there kind of cultural ties? I suppose we have sport, so there is the Commonwealth Games. David, if I could come back to you on this question, what are the other elements you think that sort of bind the Commonwealth together?
Well, yeah, we're getting deep into the meaning of words. Networks don't bind together, they network. And they would network night and day and are going on all the time. All the time we're talking. Interests and groups and young people and literary awards and scholarships and so on are buzzing around between the 54 or 56 member countries. And I mean, Sue is quite right, of course, that talking about a network where everyone is connecting with everyone doesn't fit in conceptually easily, but we have to strain our minds with the undoubted anomaly of the occupant of the British throne being the sort of head figure. The realms versus republics issue, as she very rightly says, is a distraction. It's one that I think the media find it very difficult to distinguish between the Queen as head of state and the Queen as head of the Commonwealth. And the whole tone from 1949 onwards has been that it doesn't really matter. Those countries that wish to stay as realms can stay. Those who wish to move on have moved on, and some do. Those who never wanted to be realms in the first place never have been. It doesn't really matter. And this is terribly hard to get over, because we are talking, as I say, about countries feeling their independence and need for identity, greatly enhanced, I may say, by, again, the microcircuit and the digital systems which now shape all our lives. And that is a much more powerful and interesting matter than whether they're realms or not. And we can see some of the misunderstanding popping up and leading to awkward situations. I mean, the recent royal tour of the Caribbean didn't go frightfully well, because I think it was some advisors asking our very wonderful young Prince William and his wife to appear in the old order, as it were. And when they got to the Caribbean, they found there was a new order, not unfriendly, not saying we ought to leave the Commonwealth and so on, but saying this isn't the relationship anymore. It's changed, and of course it has changed. And some of us are trying to advise how to play our role, which is not a self, as I say, a hub of the Commonwealth at all, but just part of the network in a new way, in a new partnership way. And we have a partnership every single country in the Commonwealth. And if we ignore these friends, we know who pops in and takes over, the Chinese, which they're doing now.
I think you're spot on about saying that royal visit to the Caribbean was a PR mess, really, David. But But Sue, I want to come to you on that question and stay on the question of the royals. What does it tell us about this sort of shifting relationship between royalty and the Commonwealth? And do you think there'll be a different model for who heads the Commonwealth after the Queen?
I think you're conflating two issues there. This question of the relationship of countries that are still Commonwealth realms with the royal family. I agree with David. I think that there was poor advice that was there. And actually, I also thought that there was some pretty astute public diplomacy by their hosts and saying, we're putting down markers. This is what we hope to achieve. And it was very clear from the way that the public diplomacy of the transition in Barbados's case from being a Commonwealth realm to a republic, that if this is what you choose, that we will make your way as smooth as possible. This is your choice. The idea that the monarch serves the people, and if it's no longer seen to serve a purpose, then of course you should move your relationship. This is your choice. That was very evident. In terms of the question of the relationship between the royalty and the Commonwealth, the Queen has been the most passionate advocate and its most stalwart supporter, its best diplomat in public and in private, without a doubt. The Commonwealth will change when she is no longer there, but we're going through a process of transition, an extended regency and Prince Charles has moved into the role and has done this since 2007. Many of the causes that he's championed in the long term accord with Commonwealth interests in terms of youth, in terms of climate sustainability. So I also think that there is a feeling within the wider Commonwealth of benefiting from the mainstream media's attention when a member of the British royal family appears. It's a media event, but the Commonwealth is so much more than that. And so again, it's a misunderstanding in the media that failing to appreciate the range of activities that are going on below the surface, as if the Commonwealth is an iceberg, that so much is going on below the level of the water that the wider public are not aware of, but that is enormously beneficial. Also, if they were to do away with the ceremonial headship of having a member of the royal family as ceremonial head, who would replace them? Would it rotate? Who would pay for it? It's free hospitality, it's publicity. It's also impartial engagement in the best interests of this multi-layered organization. Would it rotate round heads? Would they become involved in, or did they risk becoming involved in the domestic politics of their countries? And so until, like in Australia, which is also agonizing about whether to become a republic or not, until people have worked out what they would like instead, why not stick with the system that they've got?
Thank you. So, David, I'd like to sort of come to maybe a sort of core question about the Commonwealth, and that is sort of what it's for. And Sue, in her answer just now, talked about interests, about sort of shared interests. So let's just maybe address both of those questions. What would you say are the sort of shared values or the shared objectives that Commonwealth countries have, David? And what progress does it make towards achieving those?
First of all, the general answer is it's changing and it's evolving. And it's evolving very fast and in very new ways, which are almost only just on the map of public debate and thinking and analysis. And what I'm talking about is here security. Hitherto, up to, let's say, the turn of the century, 22 years ago, I think most of the Commonwealth togetherness, first of all, was largely ignored by the UK, which had other interests. We weren't very good evolving members of the Commonwealth then. And secondly, there was a lot of talk about trade, which of course have come from very large in the 1940s and 50s to very small by the end of the century. It was negligible, 9% or something. There were a number of non-Commonwealth organizations and associations struggling on, but generally the glue was getting pretty weak, despite the enormous commitment of Her Majesty the Queen herself and so on. Now there's a real common interest emerging, which is just beginning to dawn on people, and that is that if you want security, if you want to be able to stand up and say we are reasonably independent, we're not in anybody's sphere, you may have to ally with other countries in seeking common security interests. What I mean there is that the small islands, well, the big countries, it's pretty obvious. Australia has got its position, New Zealand has. They're a bit close to China, and they're having to work out a new relationship, as we are here in Europe, as a matter of fact. But, and Canada too, we mentioned, are they really dominated by America? I'd say they're not dominated by America precisely because they differentiate and develop different links, very clever links, I may say, given their handling of the Quebec Libre aspect of the story, which is a wonderful story of how to balance out and maintain different cultures within a culture. And obviously the overriding culture is English language connected. And Canada is a very, very good friend, as we all know. So that's the, I'm sorry, I've almost lost my theme. Yes, the small islands, of which there are, I think, 34, we said they're not of interest and so on. Now, suddenly it turns out that because China is spotting their enormous strategic interest and thinking in terms of GPS, drone and modern air control and so on, maritime areas where they can influence up to 12 miles their actual sovereign zones and up to 200 miles their continental shelves, and the difficulties and problems they can create there. Suddenly the whole overshadowing issue of the two hyperpowers trying to divide the world between East and West and so on, which to my mind is a fruitless and misunderstood project, but that's what a lot of Americans want to do and a lot of Chinese want to do. Suddenly in that context, these islands scattered across the globe become extremely interesting and extremely in need of a common outlook on security. Otherwise, we know what is happening in the Solomon Islands. The China's arrived and asked for a naval base. Officers are taken away to trainings in army in Beijing, not in Sandhurst, and it's a very different kind of trading. The weapons are traded around. And then there is, we'll come to in a moment, I know you want the problem of India, which and where that actually stands. And the problem that in recent times, during the Ukraine horror, the child killing and the murder, the unprovoked assault, to everyone's surprise, not every Commonwealth country, indeed only half of them, turned out to be sympathetic to the, what I might call the humanity, and others call Western, I think wrong, but the humanity and ordered government and rule of law camp. The others said they're fine with Russia, and I'm sure they were right. Very alarming development, that. And it brings home how necessary it is to have these common causes and have arguments, constant debate, and of course have a charter of values to which people subscribe. Well, to hold those values together, it has to be, you have to think about security as well. So there's another cause for you.
Just to check that I've understood your answer correctly, were you saying that Ukraine was something that drove a wedge into the Commonwealth or produced a split? I mean, that's certainly my impression, that there wasn't cohesion in the response to Ukraine. Is that what you've said?
It has. Sorry, am I unmuted still? Yes.
No, I can hear you still. Yeah.
It has had the potential for doing that because it's combined with a much longer standing and systematic attempt by China. China's hegemony aim is the big objective. They're tired and they're loathe America, and they're tired of feeling the world since the Second World War has been set by the West and the dollar and the Americans and their fleets going where they will and so on. That is their hate. And they want to assert, not, I think, world conquest in the old imperial sense. That's a completely out-of-date word. But I think more a sort of a dignity and an assertion that they can look to half the world, at least, as being not in the American sphere and not in the Western sphere and so on. And therefore, and to do that, they have just, in the phrase of one very enlightened and independent analyst talking to them the other day, they're hoovering up the developing world. They're hoovering up the Commonwealth, many of which, not just Commonwealth countries, do still look to Britain and to our Queen, who is, of course, a world figure, not just a Commonwealth figure. And they're realizing that if they want to stay that way and not be grabbed into new entanglements and debts, huge debts, that's a terrifying thing, they need to think about their security and think about it collectively as well.
I'd like to put this point to Sue, actually, and just, Sue, just to ask you, I mean, David has sort of presented, I think at the beginning of his answer, a suggestion that the Commonwealth has a function in terms of strategic competition and providing a sort of bond between countries. But then, as also noted rightly, I think that in the face of crises like Ukraine, there wasn't much Commonwealth unity. What's your view of that? I mean, do you think that is a function the Commonwealth has, that a function that it can do well? What role does it play in terms of sort of defence and sort of strategic coordination between countries?
Well, the Commonwealth, of course, is not a treaty organization. It contains within it countries that do have strategic treaty relationships, be they NATO countries, be they members of the Quad, be they, after all, members of the Five Eyes intelligence network. So, but the Commonwealth, as this highly diverse association, certainly, as David has underlined, has, through the articulation of its charter of 2013, lays out universal rights and as foundational values. And when he talks about security interests, I think that we need to have a broad conceptualization of what constitutes security. It's security of your institutions, it's security of your legal systems, and it's also, as far as many of the small states, and particularly small island developing states in the Commonwealth, it's security of your continued existence. Because for 25 small island states within the Commonwealth and their peoples, the Commonwealth offers voice, expertise, and access. It is the small states organization, and it helps to enhance their plight, the voice of their plight, to draw attention to it. And when it works well, the Commonwealth can augment this voice and to raise the necessity of addressing these issues. The Commonwealth did that admirably in 2015. Commonwealth got together at the Malta Summit and created a Commonwealth coordinated approach that went to the COP in Paris, and they managed to achieve extraordinary levels of agreement on the need for international collaboration to address emissions. Now, the Commonwealth is divided on this question of what more needs to be done, because it does contain, of course, those small island developing states which are confronting this existential crisis, adverse weather conditions, frequency of hurricanes, destruction of infrastructure. 40% of the Bahamas' current debt has been incurred addressing hurricane damage in the last 7 years. So if they have this, they need to augment their voice. But elsewhere in the Commonwealth, you have the big emitters. You have Australia, and of course, you have the UK. Similarly, there has been an apparent division within the Commonwealth in how to respond to the challenge to international law and to sovereignty caused by Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. And India has been identified as a significant significantly divergent on this, although it's interesting if you look at what the statements coming out of the Modi government, that now there has been a corrective in emphasizing that Russia needs to abide by international law on this, so there has been a trimming of this. But certainly the Commonwealth doesn't vote as a bloc in the United Nations. It doesn't vote as a bloc in the General Assembly. There were 9 Commonwealth countries that abstained when the United States and the United Kingdom tried to get a critical resolution put down in New York. But we have to appreciate that there are differences of opinion on this, but that doesn't mean that there cannot be coordination and collaboration on security issues, and particularly on the long-term agenda that China has of this ideological cultural practice of looking over the horizon and being focused upon a long-term strategy. It's not simply in terms of China's establishing its physical presence in port facilities, its military presence. It's also what China is doing in terms of ingress into media space, which countries are not realizing what is happening in the Commonwealth, and the danger that this then spells for freedom of expression, one of the most fundamental of human rights.
Okay, that's a terrific answer, Sue. Thanks very much. I'd like to come back to this question of what holds the Commonwealth together and what kind of function it can play. But first, before I do that, this is a bit of a tangent, but I'd just like to read out a message in the chat from Christina, who says she won an award from the UK Commonwealth Institute for a school assembly script called We Sing of the Polar Bear. This contrasted Canada and India, and the prize enabled me to spend 3 weeks in Peshawar, which supported my work with partly Pakistani pupils at Lansdowne School in High Wycombe. It's an entirely kind of marvelous message. We sing of the polar bear. I'd like to know more about this song, and what it means and what contrasts there are between Canada and India. Do either of those countries have polar bears? Canada has polar bears, right? But back to the question of the Commonwealth and the sort of common ties. I mean, I guess that sort of message I just read out from the chat hints at some of it, and hints at the suggestion that even if there aren't shared strategic goals, the Commonwealth is not a treaty organization. There might not be sort of collective security goals, but there are kind of these cultural ties. How tangible are these connections, would you say, Sue? I mean, these things that so we have the Commonwealth Games. Is there a sort of real sense of sort of commonality between Commonwealth countries, or, as one of the other members, Julia, put it in the chat, are countries really looking towards big neighbours like the US and sort of more shaped by those cultures than anything the Commonwealth really has in common?
Certainly sport is very important within the Commonwealth, and it's one of the key interests, let's face it, for Commonwealth young people, 60% of whom are under the age of 25. And I'm very much looking forward to the Commonwealth Games, which is going to be held in Birmingham very shortly. And it's enormously beneficial for smaller countries to be able to compete at international level who might not be able to send their top athletes to Olympic level. So this is enormously valuable. There are other ways in which that there are important communalities. David's made reference repeatedly to the importance of networks. There are also the networks of the professional accredited organization, networks of parliaments, networks of lawyers, networks of magistrates and judges, networks of journalists, networks of local government associations. All provide, if you like, networks of expertise which can be shared, and sharing of best practice. I went down to Zimbabwe in January of 2018 to find out how much of an interest there was in Zimbabwe returning to the Commonwealth. And I was particularly struck by the popular desire to re-engage with something bigger. Zimbabwe had left, of course, in 2003, but there was a sense of Zimbabweans wanting to reconnect with the wider sphere, but also that the benefit of the Commonwealth, that it provided a wider, if you like, collective that helped to detoxify, in their view, a relationship between London and Harare, and that Zimbabwe could learn from Commonwealth best practice in the best way to support its institutions. Zimbabwe, of course, has still not come back into the Commonwealth, although the Zimbabweans were very, very present in the Kigali summit of last month. So some of these Commonwealth links are much stronger than others. There are something like 87 different Commonwealth associations. Some are tiny, some are much, much bigger, well-funded, well-resourced, and have evident impact. It varies. I think that has to be said. But right. I think one of the enormous benefits of the Commonwealth is, talking to a Ghanaian diplomat, Dr. Moses Anafu, who was a very good friend of mine, and he emphasized the benefit and the value of the Commonwealth was its inclusivity. It's not a single issue organization, and also it's a non-racial organization that emphasizes the importance of equality. Britain is only an equal member. Britain is not first among equals, it is equal membership operating on consensus. And that is very, very important. And it also doesn't contain the United States. Within the Commonwealth, regionalism is particularly and increasingly important, but I think it is beneficial. And different regions look to different areas. In the Caribbean, they look, yes, to the United States as the regional hegemon, but they also look to Canada. South Asia, it's a different regional dynamic with different strategic, national, regional preoccupations. But it's still possible to have plurilateralism within the Commonwealth, and for the Commonwealth as a bigger collective to come together on some issues and to operate with groups within the Commonwealth highly effectively on other issues.
Thank you, Sue. I'd like to pick up one thing that you noted in passing in your answer, Sue, which is the fact that the summit was the Commonwealth Summit was in Kigali, and Rwanda is obviously a sort of anomalous member of the Commonwealth, one that doesn't have a past within the British Empire, not the only one, I think, but what's the benefit, just focusing on that country, what's the benefit to Rwanda of being in the Commonwealth?
Part of Rwanda's original decision to join the Commonwealth was to step away from the relationship with France, which President Paul Kagame felt was not beneficial. There were significant tensions with France in France's possible contribution to the original eruption of the genocide in 1994. A desire then to reach out into an Anglophone sphere, a desire for boosting the use of English, that it would be beneficial in the regional context, in a business forum, because of the use of English as an administrative language in the East African community, that it enabled Rwanda to benefit from different networks that were educational, that they were cultural, and also that they would trade. And for Rwanda to be the current chair in office is a coup. It gives a kite mark of legitimacy. Also, the current Secretary General of the Francophonie, which is France's post-imperial collective of approximately 56 countries. I have to say I haven't got the exact total in my head at the moment, but a feeling that Rwanda can then really place itself at a crossroads in Central Africa and its connectivity in other international organizations, but definitely benefiting from the kite mark of legitimacy, respectability that comes with the Commonwealth.
David, I'd like to come to you on this and maybe just develop the Rwanda point in relation to something you spoke about. You talked about the Commonwealth perhaps as being a form of a way of collectively resisting the great autocratic power of our time, which is China. But Rwanda itself is widely regarded as an autocracy, and if we say that the Commonwealth has shared values and that one of those values is democracy, how do you feel about Rwanda being a member, and indeed hosting a summit?
Well, I feel like several other countries where the pattern of democracy may be a bit shallow and fragile, that they're all under pressure. And that's what the Commonwealth is, a sort of quiet pressure group. There are standards to adhere to. And even though in his closing speech at Kigali, I think the President Kagame made some pretty rough remarks about not being pushed too much by English culture and so on, Rwanda has set itself standards to behave by. And I don't know how it will evolve and the pattern will develop, but you're quite right. There are lots of areas where the democratic procedure isn't exact. But I do want to expand on what Sue is brilliantly saying and project it onto the Indian subcontinent, because that really is the big one. In fact, it's half the Commonwealth, and it is full of contradictions. And people may say, well, earlier I was saying governments are not involved so much. Well, they're not, because it's a populist age and the populace is digitally empowered. But nevertheless, governments are very important. The Indian government isn't very, very taken by the Commonwealth integration process. I visit Delhi from time to time, as we all do, and you find enthusiasts, but they tend to be rather sort of personal, either in government or in the clubs and associations, organizations, institutes, and all the professions, rather than in government. And that is a perfect example of how the network is working. I mean, we have, and how culture, like take Bollywood, for instance, which obviously reflects, or used to reflect, Hollywood when that was predominant. But what is becoming predominant now? Answer the British film industry, which everyone says is overtaking Hollywood and linking up with Bollywood very closely. The truth is that today's clashes aren't just the military ones of soldiers and tanks and everything. They are the war is of the war against autocracies and tyrannies is being fought and weaponized on a whole range of levels, of which culture is extremely important and is a significant one. And I think even one has to understand that defense isn't just a military thing anymore. Defense is operated at intelligence levels, maritime levels that we've never heard about. I was just writing down all the quiet areas where I happen to know India is cooperating with us as never before, even though at government level there's not much activity and not much agitation. But at the intelligence level, at maritime control and joint naval training levels, at all kinds of cyber levels, we're getting closer to India by the hour. That's never picked up in the newspapers, but of course it is a necessary and inevitable outcome of the networking process. So there's a sort of change going on, and they will say, well, what about Pakistan? What about Sri Lanka? We were debating that in the Lords this morning, and people fearing that as we've taken our eye off these things for years, Sri Lanka has now got hopelessly into debt and is in danger of falling into the Russian orbit. And then someone else stood up and said, no, it's not the Russian orbit they're falling into, it's the Chinese orbit, because the Rajapaksa family were much too close to China. And there was general agreement in the House of Lords this morning that this is a matter to which can be reversed and does require attention. It does require well-placed resources from other members of the Commonwealth, the rich ones, of which we happen to be one, but not the only one. And it does require an understanding of what the autocracies are about and what their strategy is and how it can be countered without it turning into a full-blown sort of head-to-head power clash between America and China, which would destroy us all in the meantime. So this is a different world that we're moving into, and it's at work, whether we like it or not, and whether someone says we want to leave it or not, which to me would be completely balmy, but it's happening anyway.
Sue.
Jivan, if I could just respond to your question about being concerned about Rwanda being involved in the Commonwealth. I have to say I am concerned. I'm concerned by the choice of Rwanda as host, because I think there should be clear criteria for hosting a heads of government meeting, because what comes with it is the chair in office role. And Rwanda back in 2018 was a very edgy choice, and it has become more so, because I believe that there are two Rwandas. There is the Rwanda which has made extraordinary strides in terms of recovery and development since the catastrophe of the genocide. But then there is also the Rwanda of political repression, human rights abuses, and targeting of political criticism, media dissent, and I'm afraid also assassination of political opponents of the current government. So, but since the Commonwealth likes to present itself as a values-based association, having a chair in office that is problematic, I think it is deeply problematic for the Commonwealth itself, in terms if it is trying to work in terms of boosting values, supporting institutions, supporting good governance, and also a combination of development and human rights, because they must go hand in hand. Now, I also think what is troubling is that there is a progressive disengagement at heads level. So David has emphasized very eloquently that the Commonwealth is working in multiple ways and in multiple networks to try to support democracy, human rights, collaboration, etc. But at heads level, the heads meeting is one of the showcases of it, and leaders are staying away. So it's a hollowing out. It's turning into a foreign ministers get together. Now, of course, that isn't the sole activity of the Commonwealth. Multiple ways and multiple meetings that go on, of course, between these visible summits. But I think it's indicative of a lack of elite engagement and commitment to the Commonwealth and everything that it can stand for. There is a constant lament that the Commonwealth has this potentiality, but it fails to realize this potentiality. It fails to deliver. So I think there is a need for realism. I think there is a need for active engagement, and there shouldn't be casual inertia about the Commonwealth. It does require commitment and continued engagement to sustain progress and to support democracy, human rights, and development, the betterment of the members of the Commonwealth.
Thank you, Sue. I can see that Christina has a hand raised in the chat. Christina, let's come to you, and could you tell us your full name, please?
Yes, my full name is Christina Friedberg, and the reason that I raised my hand is maybe will sound a bit simplistic to some people. The script of We Sing of the Polar Bear had a scene in it which is a fable called The Six Blind Men and the Elephant. And the reason that I'm mentioning it now is because I guess some people, well, most people's view of the Commonwealth or a lot of other things, is the same as the 6 blind men and the elephant, which if you're not familiar with it,
I am familiar with it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that was my point.
Okay. So are we blind men tonight gathering together to try and describe this elephant? Perhaps we are. Sue, I'd like to just stay on the kind of Rwanda question and maybe put a sort of follow-up to that question to you, which is, do you think that membership of the Commonwealth is something that changes countries? I mean, it sounded a little from your answer as if you were thinking that it might be the reverse, as if a widening membership to countries that perhaps aren't entirely democratic is something that changes the Commonwealth. Where do you stand on that?
Well, that was part of my concern, because at the Kigali summit, it was agreed that Gabon and Togo would be included as new members. This came as a great surprise to a considerable number of those who continue to support the Commonwealth ideal. They're Commonwealth pragmatists, and Commonwealth realists, but they were very concerned that this has gone through. And the arguments that various institutions will be boosted within Gabon and within Togo, I'm afraid I don't think is realistic, and that there is an attitude of trying to take from the Commonwealth rather than trying to put into the Commonwealth and its peoples. So I'm worried, I'm concerned about the direction that the Commonwealth is moving. I'm be totally frank about that.
Who's taking these decisions? Are they being taken sort of collectively by Commonwealth governments?
They are being taken. I don't think they're sufficiently transparent. There are criteria which say how applications to join the Commonwealth should be assessed. I'm wondering whether there is sufficient due diligence which is being exercised, or whether it's a question of an individual government has a good idea and that there isn't sufficient attention paid to what's going on, and so it can go through because people aren't sufficiently committed. And wider communities and members of the Commonwealth family, that's a frequent phrase that's used, aren't actively engaged and know what's going on. And it's, after all, if this is an organization which is expanding, it's turning into more of an approach of, states' rights rather than David's argument about the connectivities. And I think that leads to a hollowing out of actually what the Commonwealth is, because I do think that those networks still have to have a core engine of activity and commitment to assist states and societies and sectors in key communal areas. If it's helping to negotiate lowering of trade barriers, if it's helping to negotiate on questions of debt, if it's helping to negotiate on questions of access to vaccines, if it's helping to negotiate on questions of connected with education and how to reform education systems to address the challenges of modern political economies.
I'd like to come to Julia Lambert, actually, who has been making an interesting point in the chat. If you'll join us, Julia, we can hear from you. You were making an interesting point about the domestic agenda. You share that with us. You should be unmuted if you accept the... We heard you for a microsecond there.
Okay, can you hear me now?
There we are, yeah.
Sorry, just, were you from host countries? Can you just repeat the question? Sorry.
So you were making an interesting point in the chat there about Rwanda and connecting Rwanda hosting the Commonwealth Summit to the domestic agenda. Did you mean the UK's domestic agenda?
It appeared so. It might have been a timing issue. The hosting would have been scheduled, possibly a couple of years ago. But I think it was unfortunate that it also coincided with the whole Rwanda, relocation issue with initiative with the Home Office. And these are precisely the kind of things that I think that we need to, when I say we, I mean UK as a member of the Commonwealth has to be, prescient about. We have to be careful about.
So there is a sort of cynical reading that you could make of Commonwealth relationships here, isn't there? Because we've heard Sue talking about possible kind of positive objectives that the Commonwealth could have around vaccines, around climate diplomacy. But then there's also this very unpleasant UK domestic policy, and that a Commonwealth member country is potentially supporting us in.
We've come at a worse time, to be honest with you, in my opinion, because I think quite a few of us have, many people, and Lord Howell and Sue have both highlighted this, have been taken aback by the kind of geopolitical split within the Commonwealth countries. You know, I speak particularly of sort of India and South Africa and countries like that, where it's always been non-aligned, but to now come down on the side effectively of Russia, it's a very real issue. And there are many, many reasons, and we should not be surprised by this. From a security issues, from a historical point of view, from the things that we've been doing here locally by getting rid of Difford, etc. You know, but there's and we should not be surprised. And I think these issues are very serious, extremely serious. And to sort of treat it as just kind of, and the Commonwealth is potentially a forum or a place where we could be addressing the sort of soft power and the sort of the complexity of these issues. And I don't, you know, it sounds like we are, but when we go and do something like Rwanda, and then it just, I think it sort of sets the agenda back.
Yeah. Yep. Thank you, Julia. We're nearly at time. I'd like to come back to you first, David, and then to Sue, and then and just sort of think about the future of the Commonwealth and what future shape it takes. I think that one of the things that sort of become clear in the course of the conversation tonight is that there are a lot of things that the Commonwealth could do. Perhaps it isn't clear what the Commonwealth should be doing. So maybe if we could address that question: what ought it to be doing, and what does it have capacity to do?
I'm afraid have you unmuted me? Yes, you have. I'm afraid I'm nearly out of time because I thought you were going to finish at 7:30 and I've got other things to go to. But I mean, there's rows of points to make, but Sue's last comments about worrying about Rwanda, understandable, particularly as it's got tangled up with the immigration issue and other things which Australia and Denmark and so on, some countries are doing, very controversial. I agree. I couldn't deny that. But the point is, I'm not sure that the CHOGM, the heads of government, is the best showcase anymore. It's a people's Commonwealth. People forget, always has been, and now the people are empowered and enormously influential in their identities and so on. It's even more a people's Commonwealth than it was before. And so if you want to look to the showcase of the Commonwealth today, I think you have to look elsewhere. And the elsewhere is the fantastic growth in the number of associations and networks, particularly professional, as Sue mentioned, that have grown up and are the real heart of the Commonwealth. This is an inversion of past concepts where governments and international institutions are on the top and the people are underneath. It's the other way around now. And there's also the very interesting point that a number of other countries, including the two rather surprising new members, which I share Sue's surprise as well, that they popped up. There are a whole string of others who we wouldn't normally associate with the Commonwealth at all. One with whom a relationship was going quite nicely before the Brexit and protocol sagas was the Republic of Ireland. I visited their mansion house in Dublin, where we had a splendid gathering, and they discussed in great detail the prospects of association with or observer status for the Commonwealth. Angola the same. At one stage, and I know this sounds ridiculous, there was a message from Washington. They wanted an office of the Commonwealth in Washington. The Japanese are always inquiring about it. I go to Japan at least twice a year. I get endless questions on the Commonwealth and how can one sort of involve, how could Japan be involved with it? Very difficult and very awkward. They've got their emperor, we've got our queen. But so all this is going on away from the heads of government attempted showcase of Kigali, which does have some awkward aspects to it. I fully agree with Sue on that. As to the future, I think this is actually increasingly becoming the pattern of international relations in the 21st century. More and more countries wanting to do their own thing and have their own pride and identity and their own websites and all the rest, and yet at the same time finding that they're inextricably in all parts of their lives, both from the intimate and daily family life up to the business and institutions and defense itself, as we've mentioned, they're finding their need to associate with others. So they turn to this club. It's a club. And it's not the only one. There are other sources, but this is the place where they're looking and they're noting that there are Commonwealth countries all around, and they meet in the coffee break, even if they don't agree in the UN Assembly, even if they don't agree when they join the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Nevertheless, that's 13 members, of whom 7, when we join, are going to be Commonwealth. And you can bet your bottom dollar that they certainly do liaise, if not in the main floor, in the Commonwealth. So this is the pattern that's emerging. It's very difficult for officialdom of the past to get to gear to understand what is happening. But the only way to understand it is to listen to it and look at it and involve ourselves in it. And then it will be seen that's not something you sort of leave or don't leave. It's something that's evolving very rapidly. A new agenda is emerging in this very dangerous world, and a multipolar world, not a bipolar world, as some people keep insisting.
All right.
And in that, I think the Commonwealth will play an increasingly important part.
David, thank you. And Sue, let me come to you and put the same question to you. What's the future of the Commonwealth?
Uncertain, I would say. David's point about the heads of government meeting, it's now a Commonwealth summit that lasts a week, and it's very important that it's a Commonwealth narrative of the People's Forum, the Business Forum, the Women's Forum, and Youth Forum. It's not just heads, and that the get together, the networking that's provided by that particular event that lasts a week is very, very important indeed. To go back, the future of the Commonwealth, Britain, and your original question, should Britain leave the Commonwealth? Britain should stay within the Commonwealth. Britain needs all the friends it can get in this very uncertain world. Britain has benefited enormously from the Commonwealth. It has benefited from Commonwealth migration and bringing professional skills, bringing cultures, opening up. The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland to the realities of the global community, and has benefited hugely from energy, initiative, professional skills, and commitment, and of migration to this country. Britain has a responsibility. And as one of the larger powers, it is the largest financial contributor to the Commonwealth in the Senate, but also in bilateral terms. In the last 4 or 5 years, Britain has committed 500 million to expressly support aspects of health, education, women in business, etc. So Britain has benefits, it has responsibilities. It cannot have a philosophy of thinking that it can lead within the Commonwealth. Britain can only lead from behind with groups of people. Britain has to listen within the Commonwealth, and it requires different sensitivities within this very, very particular, unique international association. And I continue to think that we're enormously fortunate that in many ways, Commonwealth countries have exercised collective amnesia of the way that Britain disengaged from empire. But I completely agree with David that the Commonwealth is a very, very different entity, and it continues to evolve, and we continue to benefit from it.
Thank you, Sue. This is the point of the evening at which I meant to sum up. And I'll just say very briefly that I think, have a much better idea of what the Commonwealth is. But I feel that I probably still don't have a very good idea of what the Commonwealth is for, and perhaps that will take me a few more hours of discussion. But this is not the fault of our wonderful guests, Sue Onslow and David Howell. Thank you both very much, and thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight.